All right, we're gonna begin the second half of the linguistics lecture. Slides up. All right. Second half of the linguistics lecture. We're going to deal with language acquisition, first and second language acquisition. After that, we'll talk about change in language, historical linguistics, and sociolinguistics. I may break this into two sections. We'll see how quickly it goes. Right. In any case, language acquisition. First, we talked a little bit about Noam Chomsky and his contribution to the generative grammar. Generative grammar refers to the idea that all of the possibilities of language are hardwired into our head at birth, and that is a function of evolution. Right? The human brain has evolved in large part around language. Right? We developed complex thought for probably a number of reasons, but as we did, language was figured heavily into the development of our brains. All right, so all of the grammatical possibilities of every language in the world are hardwired into our head at birth. Call it generative grammar. If you're interested in that, you might read The Language Instinct, The Biological Basis for Language. You might read The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. Noam Chomsky, I mentioned earlier in the course. I held him up as an example just of a linguist because he was the most famous linguist in the 20th century, probably still in the 21st century. He's still around. He's quite old at this point. He's also known for his political statements, which are largely very left-leaning and based on his experience in a kibbutz back in the 60s in Israel. He used to be more of a public intellectual. He used to have debates with people and things like that. He's admitted there's really no connection between his understanding of linguistics and his politics. They're totally separate things in his own mind. Right, so you may hear him on NPR if you listen to that for long enough. He'll probably turn up on there. In any case, that's why you might have heard of Noam Chomsky. Of course, if you're older, if you were 60 years old or something, you might have actually encountered some of his public debates, which again he used to do. Remember, this very different environment 30, 40, 50 years ago, before the internet and all that stuff. People used to engage in different ways in the public sphere. Right. In any case, those are the two things Noam Chomsky is known for. If you heard of him, Steven Pinker, he's also, I think, he labels himself a cognitive scientist at this point. So I could be considered a psychologist too, I'm sure. He's written a ton of books. He's very well known. They were both at MIT for a period of time, and I believe Chomsky is still at MIT, whereas Pinker's moved to Harvard at this point. Right, in any case, if you're interested in this topic and you want to understand the biological basis for language better, I'd read The Language Instinct by Steven Pinker. It's getting a little bit old now, but it's good and it was very well received at the time that it came out. All right, the biology stuff, we didn't get into that really in class. I'm going to skip that. If we talked about it from an evolutionary point of view, we talked about the development. I'm just going to glossing it over. We could talk about the development of thinking that has to do with language, and then there's a sort of a separate evolutionary trajectory, which happens at the same time, obviously, but it's a separate physical change in us, which has to do with sound making. All right, so as that thinking developed to allow us to use language in complex ways, we had our physical biology for making sound also changed, right? And it changed quite dramatically, and there had to be very intense selective pressure for people who could use language more fluently and better in order for those changes to happen. Some of the compromises that we made in order to make more complex sets of sounds for linguistic purposes have actually put us at a disadvantage in some ways. People, I'm sure, have heard of the Heimlich maneuver. People can choke to death, and so the Heimlich maneuver is posted up in every restaurant on the face of the earth because it's quite possible people could choke to death. If you ever hung around a dog, they pretty much don't choke on anything. If they do choke, they just cough it up eventually and move on with their day because they can breathe at the same time that they're choking on something, and so they can work it out. Some of the changes that we've had in our own biology in order to be able to make the range of sounds that allow us to be more fluent in language have allowed that change that also allows us to choke to death. So it had to be pretty intense selective pressure for the ability to use language in order for that compromise to happen. That doesn't usually happen in nature. We don't adapt in a way that's going to make us likely to die. So in any case, that all has to do with the evolutionary biology of language itself, how our brain developed, and how the rest of our body developed around this particular tool of language. All right, generative grammar is a concept that's important to the next topic that we're going to engage here, which is first language acquisition. Right. Earlier on, when I talked about the difference between enculturation and acculturation, I brought up the critical period for language acquisition. This is a period during which children learn language easily. Right, they're plugged into that generative grammar. They basically have all those connections wide open, and any language they're exposed to, they're just going to absorb like a sponge. And they'll never remember it. It'll become their native language. And basically anything that they're not exposed to, that they had access to as small children, that'll eventually shut off. Right. So initially we're born, we have all the possibilities of language hardwired into our head. The things we're exposed to get retained. The things we're not exposed to get just shut off. Right. It's because we're reallocating our brains to be able to do other things. Critical period begins at birth. So as soon as a child is born, the child is absorbing language. And they may not be able to figure it out and use language for a while, but they're absorbing it. So people who don't talk to their kids when they're either just babies, they don't understand anything, don't bother talking to them. That's totally counterproductive in terms of how children learn. They are listening, they are learning. You should talk to your babies for sure. Now, when does it end? Absolutely at puberty. It shuts off in stages in between, and there are people who could explain in much more detail where those stages are, and that's of interest, obviously, if you're doing child development or teaching young kids. So yeah, definitely look into the stages of the critical period if that's something you have to deal with, whether you have your own kids or whether you're teaching other people's kids. You want to understand how that critical period works. This is obviously crucial in learning second languages. Right? And I think in the class I just asked people how many of them studied a language as an adult, another foreign language as an adult, and most of the class raised their hand because they're going to end up having to do that in high school or in college to some degree. And then I asked them to hold their hand up still if they are now fluent in that language. Everybody's hand went down pretty much. And that's because once we're past the critical period, we've cut off those extra connections. We have to sort of filter the new languages that we learn through whatever is our native language. All right, so it's a lot more work. You have to spend time learning the vocabulary, learning the rules, and your brain has to kind of translate that through the language that you know. And that's much, much more difficult than the experience of a child in the critical period. A child in the critical period just gets exposed to the language, they can plug into the right connections, and off they go. Now, can you have more than one native language? Absolutely. If during the critical period you're exposed to 5 different languages, you can speak all 5 of them to a native degree of proficiency, most likely. There's no real limit on that except for your time. You can only be exposed to so many languages when you're a kid. But if you regularly hear several languages being spoken as a child by native speakers, you'll learn all of those. Those will all become native languages to you, basically. All right, so so during that critical period, absolutely shuts off at puberty. So if you are exposed to a language later in the critical period, you're not going to be quite as fluent as if you're exposed earlier in the critical period. If you want your kids to learn foreign languages, get them around native speakers when they're young. Because then they'll learn it, they won't know the difference, and they can learn to native proficiency. Even if you learn during the critical period and then never speak it again for years, maybe 20 years, you can still learn it to native proficiency later on. And it's going to be relatively easy for you to plug back into it, right? Because you retain those rules basically. Okay, so that's how the critical period work. Initially, when I brought it up, we were talking about enculturation and acculturation. Enculturation refers to the process by which we acquire our own culture, whereas acculturation refers to the process by which we acquire foreign cultures as an adult. Again, if you're exposed to multiple cultures during the critical period, your brain doesn't distinguish necessarily between culture and language. It processes a lot of things during that time differently than it will as an adult brain. All right, so the culture that you learn during the critical period is going to be your native culture. The same way your language you learn there during that period is going to be your native language. So you can also be multicultural in the sense that you can be exposed to more than one culture as a small child. Suppose you live on a border, right? And so you frequently go back and forth across the border. Say it's between Mexico and the United States. You're going to learn Spanish and you're going to learn English. And you can learn both of those native proficiency. If you're a little kid, you don't know the difference. And you may learn the cultural rules on one side of the border and the other because of exposure. So you'd be bicultural. It's easier to have multiple, 4 or 5 languages that you're exposed to than 4 or 5 cultures, I suppose, because the information sets are different. They're not as compact in culture as they are in language. But it's possible. All right, say if you live at the hub of a bunch of different cultures, that's possible. I don't know. In any case, the difference between enculturation and acculturation has to do with the same change in the brain as a child that difference between native and non-native speakers of languages have. All right. So this is first language acquisition. It's languages that you acquire during the critical period and learn to native proficiency. All right. Second language acquisition has to do with languages, much like acculturation has to do with culture, has to do with languages that you acquire after the critical period. All right, so you had to do actual study, put in a lot of work in order to understand that. You're funneling it through your native language or languages. All right, so that's the critical period for language acquisition. You need to understand that in order to understand the next thing, which is the linguistic process of creolization. Right? Creole is a term that you probably heard in some context at some point. Maybe it had to do with these things to the left. It has an Elvis movie, King Creole, and Creole Heritage Culture Association in Louisiana. Creole just means a mix of things. Right, so you might have heard Creole cooking, Creole music, all kinds of stuff. It's Creole. Just in the broadest possible sense, it just means a mix of things. I've seen it used in terms of culture, like mixed cultures. I've seen it used in terms of race, particularly in Louisiana in the South. That's why they tend to use the term in Louisiana, because there are a bunch of different cultures that mix together there. Here we're talking about it in terms of language only. Right? Creolization as a linguistic process. This process begins with something called a pidgin, P-I-D-G-I-N, not G-E-O-N, that's the bird, P-I-D-G-I-N. A pidgin is a hybrid of 2 or more languages with simplified grammar and vocabulary. A pidgin is a hybrid of 2 or more languages with simplified grammar and vocabulary. Now, in what circumstance would that sort of thing ever occur? It has to do with the critical period. All right. If adults who are past the critical period are forced to interact with each other, usually they don't take the time to learn the other person's language because that's a lot of work, particularly if they're forced to work with each other in another sort of context. Like say you have a factory in upstate New York somewhere. So you got native English speakers that are working at this factory, and suppose they had a community of people who moved to that area specifically to work in the factory. They maintained their own sort of cultural institutions and groups and hung around with each other. And they were from some South American countries, so they were speaking Spanish. And suppose another group of Eastern European immigrants who are speaking Russian, and they all have their own communities. They speak their own native languages in their own communities. So you got Russian speakers and Spanish speakers and English speakers. They all go to work together, however, in the same factory. Right? Now they're working 10 hours a day in a factory. They're not going to spend time learning each other's languages, really. They have their own communities. They don't need to have social interaction in another language. On the other hand, they do have to get things done in the factory. So what they'll do is they'll kind of cobble together a language using bits and pieces of all the different languages that people speak in this particular setting, and that'll be called a pidgin. Right? So they'll grab some vocabulary from the English and the Russian and the Spanish and just put it together in word orders that make sense in English or Russian or Spanish or maybe none of them, but it's just kind of cobbled together. And it's what they call a broken language. Right? It's not a fully functional human natural language. We would call it a language still, but it's not fully functional. It's not like all the details aren't smoothed out. It's missing vocabulary. It can't do every single thing. The grammatical constructs tend to be simplified in comparison to what you find in the native languages. It's a broken language. That's a pigeon, and that's one circumstance in which a pigeon may occur. Also in borderlands, you may find pigeons, where people just they run into each other, but they don't have sort of deep interaction, so they have some pigeon language that they speak together. All right, so this is sort of the first stage of creolization. You see, there's the mixing, but it's not fully creolization. A Creole, linguistically speaking, is a fully functional human natural language. Pidgin is broken language. However, two or more languages, simplified grammar and vocabulary. All right. Creolization is what happens when a pidgin gets native speakers. Now, don't confuse a pigeon with a person. A pigeon is not a person. A pidgin is a language that is spoken by people that is broken. All right, that pidgin refers to the language. So when there are native speakers of a pidgin, well, how does that have to happen? The adults who are speaking the pidgin have to have kids. Those kids are within the critical period for language acquisition. That is, they can plug into the generative grammar, and they grow up speaking their native language. Each one of them speaks their own native language. Obviously, they're going to speak whatever their parents speak. They're going to speak their friend's language, because why not? They're within the critical period. They're exposed to a language. They're going to pick it up. All right, so they're speaking their language, their own language. They're speaking their friends' languages. So a kid growing up in that environment may learn Russian, may learn English, Russian, may learn Spanish. Maybe a kid's got friends in each one of those communities and learns all three of those to native proficiency. Also will grow up speaking the pidgin, though. Right? And there may even be more of a focus on that. And what happens when you get the kids speaking it is because they can plug into that generative grammar, they can fix all of the broken bits in the pidgin. Right, so again, look at the definition of a pidgin: hybrid of two or more languages with simplified grammar and vocabulary. The kids will fill in the missing grammar. They'll fill in the missing vocabulary because they can just they can create that, fabricate that out of their own heads if they have other kids to talk to. Right? Once they're past the critical period, they can't. They don't. And that's why we had the pidgin in the first place, because it was adults that ran into each other and just had to cobble something together. Once the kids get a hold of it, they fix it and turn it into a fully functional human natural language. And that is called creolization. And the end result of that is called a linguistic Creole. All right. Now, there are many languages, most languages probably have gone through the process of creolization multiple times in the past. Right? This is not an uncommon process at all. You've probably heard of a language called Creole, and depending on where you're from or where you ran into it, it may have been a different language than the one the person next to you heard of. I knew one person who said she spoke Creole. She was applying for an internship, I think, at the FBI or something. They decided to check on it, which of course they're going to do. They put her in a room with somebody else who also spoke Creole, because the languages are still referred to as Creole. One was from Haiti. She was from Louisiana. They were talking about two different languages, which had been gone through this process. There was a period when there was a pidgin, and then the kids got a hold of it and fixed it. And they fixed it in different ways. So there are common parent languages between the Haitian Creole and the Louisiana Creole, but they didn't turn out the same way. Right? So there was some mutual intelligibility just because the parent languages were the same. But basically, they didn't know what each other were talking about. Right? Because they're two different languages. They just happen to retain the term Creole in their language, or the Creole to describe their language, because the process had happened relatively recently within historical memory. Right, so Haitian Creole and Louisiana Creole are actually different. They went through different processes. Both of them went through a process of creolization. They had nothing to do with each other at the time that they did. So that's the process of creolization. It starts with the pidgin. Kids in the critical period for language acquisition fix the pidgin, and it becomes a fully functional human natural language. As I said, most languages have gone through a process like this at various points in the past. Just as long forgotten. English, for example. If anybody ever looked at Old English, it's basically not intelligible to a person who speaks modern English. Middle English, you got a shot at understanding, but Old English is going to be really more like German. And you might say, well, what happened? How do we have that big leap? Well, it was people who migrated from the continental Europe, onto the British Isles. They were already speaking Celtic languages there. Those mostly got displaced and pushed off, although there's sort of a substrate of Celtic in English. So some of the structures from the Celtic languages were retained in or integrated into the Old English language. they settled there for a period of time, and the language changed during that time. At the same time, it was also influenced by other people who invaded the island, like people collectively known as Vikings from Scandinavia who came over. There was a huge Danish presence on the island for a long period of time, from like I don't know 600 and after, to the point that they had a separate political entity on the island at the same time as the Anglo-Saxons, who again brought the Old English. So at that time, there were cases of pigeons developing, and a massive simplification of English from Old English to Middle English that happened. All right, so English relatively recently went through a process that was very much like this. We don't necessarily think about that. We figure it must have been the same forever and ever. But if you go back 500 years, you're talking about Middle English, and we can see that there have been a lot of changes since then. Still, it's kind of intelligible to us; we can understand it. We go back further than that, and that was before they had this big change. I mean, a lot of the complexity of Old English got wiped out of it because we had people who didn't speak it as a native language learning the language and changing it to make it easier. All right, so that's a whole other history we could get into, but we don't have forever to do this. Okay, so that is the linguistic process of creolization. And yeah, there was a short video which isn't even showing up on here because it's plugged into another drive. The video walked us through an example. I'm not posting these up. I thought about doing that before, but I ran into some issues with that, so I don't really do that. I'll explain the relevant parts. We did get a couple of terms out of the video, so I'll tell you what those were. It was on an example in Central America where deaf children were concerned. Right, so there was a woman who had grown up deaf, and she was in a rural area, and people didn't really know what to make of it. They didn't know how to interact with her. They didn't know she just had a hearing loss problem. They thought maybe she had some other psychological issues or whatever else was wrong with her. They just kind of avoided her. And so she grew up with something called a poverty of stimulus. That's a term that you want to get down, poverty of stimulus. And that refers to a circumstance in which a child went through his or her entire childhood, the critical period for language acquisition, without being exposed to language at all. And that's what this happened to this one woman. She was deaf. Her name was Mary No Name. Literally, that's what they called her, because nobody bothered to name her, or claim a family name or anything like that. So Mary No Name grew up with poverty of stimulus. She ultimately was deaf, so that's why people didn't interact with her exactly. But when they tried to teach her sign language, she had an inability to understand syntax. Right? I think I introduced the term grammar as well. Grammar is the combined syntax and morphology in a language. It's a term that you'll want to have too. All right. So she couldn't understand that. She could understand vocabulary, like she could learn a word, but she couldn't figure out how to put them together in meaningful ways. All right. So the syntax was missing, and it was impossible for her to learn that. All right. So in rare cases, when a poverty of stimulus happens, and it's rare because usually children don't survive if they're isolated to the point that they don't get exposed to any language. But if a child manages to do that, they can survive to adulthood without ever being exposed to language, suffer this poverty of stimulus, they can never learn language. Right? So there are some cases. We did go through some cases in class. I think those were the example, again, the video example. There was another group of deaf children in the same country who were not isolated in the country. They were sent into an orphanage in the city. And what happened was they got together, and because they had interaction with each other, and during the critical period for language acquisition, they were able to construct a language from scratch. Right? So they actually created their own sign language. Right? And that's an important point here about the human capacity for language. If children have anyone to interact with, even if they don't speak any language at all, they can create a language from scratch entirely. Right? And in some severe cases, initially this was termed twin speak, because there was a case where there were neglected twin girls, and they were kept alive by some means, but basically nobody interacted with them, but they had each other to talk to, so they created a language all on their own, basically. So there's this language totally invented by these two girls, which functions like any other language, but nobody else in the world speaks. Right? It's called so they call it a twin speak because they happen to be twins in that case. But there are some other cases, I suppose, where that has happened. But it speaks to the capacity that we have. Right? We have this biological capacity for language. If we're exposed to any language in the world, we can learn it like a sponge when we're a kid. Past the critical period, a whole other issue. We got to funnel through our native language. If we miss that window, we lose the ability of language, basically. Now, on the other hand, that capacity is so strong that if we're exposed to anybody, even without having exposure to language, just another mind to bounce our language off of, we will create a language from scratch, which is quite amazing. All right. I think those were the takeaways from the film, and I'm going to break there. All right. That was the first half of the second half of the lecture. If we're in the fall 2020 section, that is where we happen to end. Before we're talking about an exam and all that stuff. If somebody's looking at this later, it doesn't matter. I'm going to make another section to fill in the rest. But that is where we actually ended in class, in the fall 2020 section. So I'm going to break this here, and I'll add another section as we get to the other information. All right.